If you listen to Early Breakfast regularly, you will know that every Thursday I speak to Dr. Roger Gievell. He is CEO of Fair Money and a personal finance expert. Dr. Roger gets very excited and animated about the stories that he speaks about. If you don't believe me, he joins me now. You can see for yourself. Dr. Roger Gievell, good morning to you.
Good morning, James.
You seem very calm at the moment, but I dare say we'll get animated in a second. Look, just before I ask you about the stories that you've put to us, I cannot overemphasize, I cannot say enough, I cannot make enough noise about this. The biggest US rate rise in 22 years with more to come. That's the front page of today's Telegraph business section. The front page of today's Times newspaper. We can cope with rising inflation, insists the Prime Minister, but interest rates set to hit a 13-year high of 1%. Look, you do personal finance, Roger. Can you just spell out, so it's not me having a rant, can you just spell out what it means when interest rates rise and how significant is what's going on at the moment?
I think it's very significant, and the biggest problem is always, do the banks and mortgage lenders pass on enough of that rise to us? And the answer is no, they never do. Just like Rishi Sunak's 5p reduction on petrol, my survey showed 80% of petrol stations didn't bother passing it on. This is the thing. In tolerant, beautiful Britain, where, we always hear the other guy's side of the story, people get away with murder. I think the question of a windfall tax on the banks that your caller just raised a moment ago is certainly something the government should be considering instead of sitting around having these long cabinet meeting deliberations.
Yeah, but you say that, but wouldn't it be better if they just collected the tax that they were owed from companies and corporates? And if the rules aren't necessarily bringing in the tax, change the rules. If you start bringing in windfall taxes, the upshot of that is that people who rely on pensions and returns and all that sort of stuff, they get hit. So what you're really doing is you're just taxing ordinary investors and savers.
Well, you are, but when you have the kind of profits that the oil companies and the energy giants have made recently, and the fact that the Times front page yesterday referred...
but you talk about BP and say, oh, they made so much money. Yeah, they just lost £16 billion because they were forced to sell off their Russian entity in Rosneft. So, it swings and roundabouts, and they'll just play that game, and they'll say, OK, fine, tax us on our profits. Here are a whole load of losses that we just got. Here's a zero of zero.
Well, I mean, it is a conundrum, but it's us. It's the saver and the investor and the borrower that's always going to get squeezed.
We are always going to get squeezed. That's what we learned from this, Roger. We've got to learn to tighten our belts and spend less. So let's talk about it. So Warren Buffett and his sidekick. He may be 90-plus years old, but when he speaks, people listen. He and indeed his colleague have been talking about cryptocurrencies. What have they said?
Well, a couple of days ago on this marvelous program, it was mentioned that Warren Buffett and his partner, Charlie Munger, warned the world against cryptocurrencies, and they actually predicted that their value is going to end up being zero, zilch. These amazing gents who, as you say, are amongst the most successful investors and richest people in the world are fast approaching their 100th year. So they can be forgiven for forgetting a few things. But what they don't seem to remember is that Mr. Buffett said not that many years ago that he would not touch tech with a barge pole. I'm sure he doesn't refer to that pronouncement very much these days. Now, there's no doubt, James, that when we invest in cryptocurrencies, we've got to be careful. But there's now so much governmental, institutional, regulatory attention, initiatives, et cetera, going on with this that I just don't believe it can simply be a flash in the pan, a South Sea bubble, a Madoff Ponzi scheme.
And isn't this the point where sometimes people put so much credibility into somebody who has made some very good investments, and then they assume, and this is what we've done across the board, we assume that from past performance that somebody can see into the future, and it's never the case. It's in the same way that we asked our experts to provide advice and thoughts and projections. And what I always say is, look, I'll tell you what I think might happen, but I cannot see into the future, no matter how much I know my subject. Say, for example, I tout myself as a property expert. I spent 15 years in real estate, actually longer, and I'd like to think that I understand. But what I can't do is I can't predict what a market is going to do. I can tell you what I think I might do as an investor, and hopefully, as an investor, you get things more right than wrong. But that's very different to seeing into the future, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you're a very careful man, James, which is why you're sitting here every day telling us the things you tell us, because you do it cautiously. Now, for Buffett to say, I wouldn't touch tech with a barge pole, then flip completely some years later and now say cryptocurrency, this entire market, with Goldman Sachs yesterday making the first ever cryptocurrency loan, is going to turn to rubbish and everybody's going to end up with zip. It's just a bit extreme. It's almost publicity seeking. I know he doesn't look like that sort of a chap, but I just don't get it.
Okay, then there we go. We can ignore it then. Let's move on. Can we ignore it?
Well, I think I would like to, if I may, focus everybody's attention today on one area, which is DeFi, D-E-F-I, or decentralized finance. Now, this is the relatively new, aptly acronymed Generation Z millennial-driven initiative for a democratized, decentralized...
Hang on, Roger, are you turning into a sesquipedalian?
Yeah, yes, I'm afraid so.
You know what a sesquipedalian is, I assume?
Go on.
A sesquipedalian is somebody who uses a long word where a short word will do.
Yeah. Well, that's their words. I mean,
So where do these words come from?
Well, democratized and decentralized, I mean, it would take too much time right now to explain them, but I mean, they're quite valid and they're actually pretty decent descriptions. It means everybody's involved. There's no central control. There's no central bank. There's no exchange. There's no regulator running things. It's all kind of peer-to-peer. And they see the $7 trillion market for DeFi, pushing aside the operation of all traditional financial services markets.
So that means
insurance, lending. Yeah.
Yeah. So now listen, we're up against it time-wise, so we're going to have to be very quick now because we've gone on and on and on about cryptocurrency. Let's talk very briefly about stocks and shares.
Yeah. Stocks and shares, I'm pretty certain I'm going to have my ticket to the stockbroker's annual dinner withdrawn, but I do have to issue a bit of a warning. Inflation is rampant. It's still accelerating, and this means that the value of almost everything is dropping. It isn't rocket science to realize that the value of shares that we hold in companies is fast eroding, except for those few that can outpace it. Morgan Stanley points out that our inflation right now, James, is at its highest level in 40 years, and that real corporate earnings have now fallen to the lowest yield in over 70 years since the 1950s. The Standard & Poor's stock market index could consequently fall by as much as 17%. So I'm sorry to issue another caution here, but just think a bit more carefully as you're buying shares than you might normally do, or consider the ones you're holding on to, because how would a 17% loss in your portfolio feel?
You've got to be very careful. And when Morgan Stanley speaks, having worked for them in the past, yes, I'm listening. Very quickly, almost in a sentence, direct debit highway people.
Right. Front page of the Times, investigation. Our energy giants are now up to the next thing, which is to inflate the amount of money being taken from people's direct debits in order to, quote, help their cash flow, unquote, sometimes without the consent or even knowledge of the client. I could go on for a few more paragraphs, but time is in. I just want to say I have one tip about this. If you Google my surname, Gewolb, G-E-W-O-L-B, and the words amazing direct debit, you will see a little known fact that you can actually claim back from these companies or anybody what you've been paying under direct debits if you feel they've been unfair to you. You tell your bank, and the bank will generally send the money back to you. So that's a pretty good lever to negotiate with.
Certainly is. Dr. Roger, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, once again here on Talk TV. It's much appreciated. So that's Dr. Roger Gewolb. He is CEO of Fair Money, personal finance expert. Thank you for that.